Okay, so Lindy, Greer, thank you very much for taking the time today to talk to the students at Waterloo. We're going to talk about startup teams and getting them to work effectively. But I thought I would just start with you with asking you to please describe the areas you focus on in the work that you do at Stanford and here today.
Well, I'm happy to be here today. Thanks for inviting me in. My research at Stanford, I'm coming from a team dynamic perspective more generally, of looking about how you structure teams and what that does to the process of how people get along or when they fight, and ultimately what that does to team performance. Once I moved out to Stanford a few years ago and moved to Silicon Valley, I got obsessed with startup teams. Startups are such a unique form of team. They're so different than any other type of team that we research in terms of consulting teams, finance teams, etc. Startups are their own world. So since the last couple of years now, I've been spending a lot of time in that world, both in terms of my research and my teaching, to understand what makes these types of startup teams work or not. So one of the things I'm really excited about right now is a project I have on how to structure early stage startup teams. That when you go into early stage startups, at least from a psychological perspective coming in, one of the biggest problems is it's just chaos. No one knows what they're supposed to be doing or who reports to who or who has responsibility over what. And sometimes they don't even know who the leader is. And what we expect and that we're finding now in this new line of research is that structure can help. So what we've been doing to test this idea is we've been having early stage startups at incubators around the United States come to us for a training. And for half the startups, we give them an exercise on job crafting, where each person in the team reflects on what they uniquely bring to that specific startup that no one else has in terms of their knowledge, their expertise, their ability. And then they redesign the role description to be very specific to what they can do in the team that no one else can. And each person in the team does this, and then they share it as a group and discuss it. And it actually is a pretty cool discussion because sometimes you learn something about a teammate that you didn't know they were good at, or maybe about their preference for the type of work that they wanted to do that you didn't know about. And so it helps really clarify where people stand in terms of one another, in terms of the roles, so like the horizontal differences, if you will, of just the different types of things that people can do in the startup. So what we're finding then is that the teams that go through this intervention compared to the teams that don't perform better on a task that we give them in afterwards. And the task that we give them is a marshmallow challenge, which is a prototype task. And so they have to build a tower out of spaghetti sticks and marshmallows and see who can build the tallest and most stable tower. It's a lot of fun. And what we're finding is that the height of the tower and the stability correlates with how much funding the startups have and how much revenue they make. So it's a pretty representative task of the daily work of a startup, which is pretty cool. And so what we're finding then is in teams who've gone through this training to clarify their roles and to put some structure into the startup, they do better. They're better able to coordinate to know who to go to for what. And this is particularly the case in startups that have identified a leader, where if we asked them in a survey before they came, if they had a clear leadership structure or clear status hierarchy, the teams that had that and had the role differences did best. And so we're sort of calling this project and like this new theory, the matrix structure of startup teams, to resurrect a horrific old concept and give it a fun new twist. That is particularly in the context of early stage startups, having a matrix where you clarify your structure both horizontally in terms of the roles, but also vertically in terms of leadership, allows early stage startups to outperform any other type of startup. And so it's interesting that as you can see often in early stage startups, the biggest mistake is doing nothing, so no structure. The other mistake that they make that's interesting that we're finding then is if they only differentiate horizontally. So maybe they figured out roles, but there's not really anybody taking the lead to coordinate across the roles, also a disaster. Another mistake they make is that they hire people that are similar to themselves. You have 5 programmers, and maybe you have a clear leader, but then all the other programmers are going to say, well, why do you get to be the leader or the CEO have more equity than me? Because we're all programmers. And so those teams also fall prey to a whole host of problems. So the one type of early stage startup that really does well is the one that has this matrix. That they clarify the differences both horizontally and vertically at the same time. So that's something I'm really excited about, and I could talk about further, but, a brief overview. And so we're about to write that up for a journal right now. I'm really excited about it.
It's very interesting. I mean, what you seem to be introducing there, I guess, is that the structure of teams and thinking carefully about how your team as a startup is going to work is something that has a direct relationship to your success as a startup. So that's a good introduction and clearly emphasizes why this conversation is important. And
yeah, it matters. It matters for the bottom line of these startups.
Okay, so you're looking clearly at startup teams, and How do you think, you've mentioned there in terms of structure, but I guess more generally, how does a good startup team differ from a poor one?
So in my course I teach here on the psychology of startup teams, the number one takeaway I want my students to get out of the 2-month long course is to be as intentional about the people side of their startup as they are about their product. That so too often as startup teams, they give a lot of attention and time and thought to their product, to their consumers, to even their funding structure. But the people side of who should you hire, how should you onboard, how do you motivate workers, how do you retain workers, the whole people side just is accidental. It happens along the way in a rush. And they don't take the time to be intentional up front about who do we want to be as a company, what is our vision, what do we want to have as a culture, how does that determine who we should hire. And then once we have this company up and running, how do we manage conflicts? How do we set norms? It just sort of happens along the way, the accidental startup, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see over and over again is startups that are intentional. Particularly this comes often with entrepreneurs who are on their second, third, fourth, fifth startup. They become more intentional in this domain. Startups that are intentional about people and the practices around people outperform other startups.
Makes sense. And as part of what you've talked about before, you've talked about creating a dream team.
Yeah.
And so I was keen to understand what you meant by that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. A lot of my interest in research and teams, I started my dissertation on diversity and how the individual traits and characteristics you bring to the team could determine the success or failure of a team. So when I got into the startup world, that was one of my burning questions that I wanted to understand is who are the people you put into the team in the first place? What are the inputs for this, product that you're making? Because the inputs do determine the outcome. And so based on the interviews that we've been doing out here and working with startups in the area, to me, the two main things to look for when you're creating the dream team is similarity and values. And that includes a common passion for the product that you absolutely believe in and love across the board, everybody in the team, this thing that you're making, that you're willing to give up your life, you're willing to work hundreds of hours, to make this happen. So you share that passion for the product. And ideally, a few other common values. That one of the big questions that can make or break startups is why are you in the startup in the first place? Do you have a similar value for that? Some people are in a startup to make it big and make money. Other people are in it to sell quickly and become a serial entrepreneur. Other people are in it for the lifestyle. They just don't like the tech world or larger companies and they want a startup. And so when you hit crucial points along the way, if you have different values about where you want the company to go or how you want the company to be, you're going to have a lot of issues. So having similar values up front in terms of valuing the product and the mission and the goal of the product, of valuing the startup experience or for the same reason, helps a lot. So similar values and complementary skill sets. That one of the other mistakes that startup founders often make is hiring buddies and friends that are similar to themselves. Mm-hmm. But then you have an overlap of roles. It's going to be very difficult to figure out who's going to do what. It's harder to split equity. And often you're missing then key skill sets that are needed. And so making sure up front that you think about for the specific product that we want to make, what are the skills we absolutely need in the early stage, middle term, and long term, and that you hire based on the task demands of the product rather than just necessarily thinking, oh, I want to work with so-and-so. That you're very intentional about what skill sets you need in the team and you hire skill sets that are complementary to one another and are crucial to the task that you're doing.
Makes sense. And presumably that's going to vary according to the nature of the startup itself.
Exactly. Yep, absolutely. So similarity in values, complementary in skill sets.
Okay, and the role of a leader in a startup team, what do you see that as? What's important there for them to think about?
This has been fascinating for me because leadership in the startup world often looks different than it does in larger companies. And so how do you be the type of leader that can scale and be sort of the more day-to-day leader in an early stage startup versus a leader in a larger company? It takes someone that's very flexible and someone who's open to experimentation. That a lot of the leaders in startups that I've seen do very well or have executive coaches that enable them to sort of learn and to change and adapt as the startup grows, because it's pretty easy to go in with a set style of interacting, which works maybe for one phase but not the other. And so flexibility is a big thing for leadership in startups. Another thing that's interesting for leadership in startups, particularly early stage startups, which is where I focus primarily, is autocratic leadership typically doesn't work. that CEOs and sole founders who centralize the startup around them and basically make a company that can only operate by flowing through that single person, set their company up for failure. If they're sick, if they have an off day, the company goes under. Also, the people aren't able to communicate with one another. Often they're scared to communicate to the leader because the leader's created such a strong central power hold. And in an early stage startup especially, you need all hands on deck. You need everybody able to speak up, to pitch in, to voice their concerns, and to have some pretty good task conflicts. And if you centralize power around an autocratic leader, you're not going to have that type of culture. So that's one of the big leadership mistakes in early stage. The other thing is the opposite that you see a lot in early stage startups is that no one is willing to step up to the leadership role. Or there is someone in the leadership role who's scared to exert leadership and asks everybody for their opinions a million times over and is way too modest and humble. And so what I've seen is sort of the sweet spot for leadership in early stage startups is a very soft-handed leader. That everybody in the startup can point to that one person clearly and say that is the leader. At the end of the day, that is a person we know who will call the final shots, who has the courage to make tough decisions and guides us and has a clear vision for where we're going. But that's also someone that we're comfortable going for lunch with, having a coffee with, talking to, sharing our concerns about the company. That the person exerts leadership in a way that people feel they can also have influence in the company. There's a very light touch with leadership. And then being able to maintain that as you scale is hard because you do have to build a little bit more power distance in as you scale. And that's where the transition comes in. You need to be a little bit flexible. But particularly in early stage, the startups really value somebody who is the leader, clearly from their body language and the way they speak and they make decisions, yet are very open and warm and, able to take feedback and to share leadership with experts. Because if you have a 3-person startup, each person in the team is there because they bring a critical skill set. And so you need those people to speak up more so than you do in a larger organization. So you really need to be able to back off the autocratic leadership in those settings.
Makes sense. And the vision inside a startup is something you've referred to a little bit in your answers. How is vision created? How is it shared? And how does it become a focus for the team?
That's a great question. Vision to me is the backbone of a startup. If that's not clear and that's not there, everything else goes under. Culture, motivation, ability to attract the right workers, etc. So in my course, my Psychology of Startup Teams course, my students have to find a startup in the community and coach them in terms of their psychology to make them better. And what was really interesting this year is across the, 40 or something startups that my students worked with, it's saying that almost all the problems my students came across in these startups could be traced back to a lack of vision. That, for example, a startup's having trouble retaining their workers, and it turns out, well, what's the main issue then is the startup doesn't really know who they are. They don't have a clear vision for themselves and the product, and so then when they hire people, they just don't quite fit in because they weren't clear up front when they were hiring who they were looking for. Yeah, the other startups have issues of the workers just aren't motivated. They don't put in a lot of effort. They want to leave early. They're not happy there. And if you go to the office, there's no culture. There's nothing on the walls. It's a very drab, boring office. There's just no one wants to work there. And again, you could argue that comes back to a lack of a vision of who they want to be as a company, and they're not able to bring that over into the rituals and the symbols of the office. And so there's so many of these common problems that go back to the importance of having a clear vision up front. And in terms of how to set a vision then, so if you either are starting out in a startup or you're in a startup and you realize you actually don't have a very clear vision, how do you do it? So one of my favorite games to play with startups is the random corporate serial killer game. So there's a corporation, they've offered to buy your startup. They're going to give everybody jobs at different companies. No one's going to go on the street. However, this product, this thing that your company is all about, is going to be wiped out from the market. The corporation doesn't want that to be brought to the world. So then to reflect in the startup, what would be lost to the world? What value wouldn't be there anymore when your product disappears? Is it the ability to bring internet to disadvantaged areas of the world? Is it a medicine to help sick people? Like, what is that value that you believe the world needs to have? And that should be the starting point for your vision. What is that very important, deep value that's driving you to make this product? And then to build your vision around that. I think visions, people often confound vision and mission. A vision is very short, very snappy. Like Stanford back in the day, 50 years ago, our vision was to be Harvard of the West. Very clear goal, just a few words. It inspired a lot of competition. You had a very clear benchmark. You can know when you've attained it or not. And it definitely was a good war cry, and just by that words, they knew what we wanted to emulate. We wanted to have the same level of research and teaching as Harvard did in that day. And so it set a lot. So thinking then, like, once you start to know what those key values are, what is the achievable target in 5 to 10 years? They say the best vision has a 50% chance of making it. So it's risky. You have a pretty good chance of making it, but you also have an equally good chance of not making it. So something where you set a very big goal, a hairy, audacious goal, if you will, and then capture that in, 5 to 10 words is the best vision for a startup. And then that catchphrase should be something that's just embedded in everything that you do.
So you see the vision as something that unites the actions of people inside the organization. And perhaps, I guess, maybe more broadly, culture would reflect that vision too.
Yeah.
So is there a type of culture that a startup team should have, and how should they go about creating a culture?
That's a fascinating question. So for what type of culture a startup should have, I think the most important thing should be that the culture is in alignment with the values of the founders. And that starts with self-awareness on the part of the founders and making sure their values match their product. And then that's been articulated into a clear vision. And the culture should be entirely aligned with the vision, because if it's not, if there's incongruencies with that, you're going to have problems. So I used to be involved in corporate social responsibility a lot in the Netherlands. And there was a great example at one point of a company who had changed their vision to be about being green. Yet the CEO would show up to work in an SUV. It totally eroded the culture, created suspicion, mistrust, and made for a very toxic culture because the values in the company between the CEO, the founders, the leadership, and that vision was not in alignment with how the culture was trying to be created. So having signs about recycling your papers or the coffee machine just really rubbed people the wrong way when the CEO was driving his SUV to work every day. And so having a culture that's authentic, that is in alignment with your own values, is number one. So in that sense, every startup is going to have a slightly different culture because it's going to depend on who you are as founders. There's a great startup down in LA that does socks, and the founders love surfing. And so if you walk into their startup, it's all about surfing. You have surfboards, you have a surf theme, and just like the whole spirit of the surf world is part of their culture, of the free-spiritedness, the bravery, the adventure. That's all part of the sock company. And you wouldn't necessarily think a sock company needs its values, but in this company, it's what works to create a dynamic environment for the founders and attracts people to them who like working in that type of environment. So I don't think there's necessarily always a right answer to what type of culture you should have, as long as it matches who you are as a founder. Additionally, there is some studies now that have been done over, if you look broadly across all startups and all cultures, what dimensions are important. And in the startup world, flexibility and adaptability is big. So having a culture that is flexible, that is adaptable can help. Also, given the need to adapt, innovation is critical. And so often having a dimension of your culture that is focused on some level of innovation, creativity, learning, or growth can help a lot. Of having a culture that embraces people speaking up, of pitching in, of thinking outside the box, tends to help with the type of market that a startup usually operates in. How do you instill it? Was the third part of that question, which is also fun to talk about. So culture isn't everything. It's on the things you have on your walls. It's the stories people tell at the coffee machine. It's in your manual that you give to people that you hire. And so you really need to think holistically and intentionally, I would argue, about culture as a founder and how you can build it into all aspects of your environment. Because, again, going back to the example of the car you drive versus the signs over the coffee machine, all these things matter to how people within your company perceive your company. And so you really need to make sure that everything is in alignment, because if two bits of that do not agree with one another, you create a toxic culture. So one of my favorite things to talk about is small wins in startups. That startups have so much ups and downs, and so building in cultural practices that celebrate achievements are big, and having a unique celebration that's unique to your culture and to your people. So, for example, there is one startup I've talked to. They love a certain genre of movies, and in that movie genre, there's a type of dance they do in the movies a lot. So whenever they get an easy win, they do this dance as a company together. There's another company that really liked socializing and American family values. So they had a soft serve ice cream machine next door to the founder's office. And so there's a 3 p.m. ritual every day to come in and celebrate what's going on over ice cream and to talk about it. So building in practices like that to culture helps. Another thing that's interesting in terms of like diagnosing your culture and changing it is asking people who the heroes are within the company. Like if you look to other startups or to other founders or to tech or to products, like what are the stories people really look up to with awe? And making sure that those stories are in alignment with what you want them to be. And even up front, when you hire people, that you give people heroes. Like when you onboard people into your company, what are our role models? Who do we aspire to? Like with the Stanford example of being the Harvard of the West. When you would hire new professors to Stanford, you'd be very clear. This is at this point for Stanford, this was our hero, Harvard. We want to be like them. This is what they look like. This is your job now, is you need to help our company look like that. And so then people at the coffee machine would talk about, gee, at Harvard, they do this and this and this. How can we do that here? And so the stories are a big part of culture. And then also the office setup of if you want to have a very inclusive, participative culture where people talk to one another, be intentional about how you put your desks together. Do you put the desks in every corner of the office or do you put them together in a circle? Physical space matters a lot for how people interact. It can make or break culture. So physical space, stories, onboarding of how you hire people, and the things that you tell them when you hire them matters a lot. People take that seriously. Also, your website matters. It sounds silly, but there's been studies that have shown that the size of the pictures of, say, the CEO compared to other people has impact on how hierarchical or participative the culture is. It's to make sure, again, that every aspect of your company presenting externally and internally aligns with what you want your culture to be.
Great things there for people to think about in their own startup and how they can develop their culture. The other aspect for me is as the startup grows, what can they do to either preserve or should they preserve their startup culture, and what might they do to develop it? I guess what should happen as they grow.
That's a great question. One of my favorite books on this is Scaling Up for Excellence by Huggy Rao and Bob Sutton at Stanford. It's a great book if you haven't seen it. My own personal interpretation of this, of how you do this, is one, to realize that there are certain aspects of your culture that might have to change as you expand. So the familiarity and the egalitarianism of an early stage startup is hard to have when you have 100 employees. And so accepting the fact that you are going to have to build in more structure in terms of either hierarchy or even something like holacracy with the reporting circles, but you are going to have more structure built in, and you can no longer, as a CEO, afford to talk to every employee on a daily basis anymore. That is going to have to change, and that you do have to be intentional up front to design systems and structures that are scalable. One of the organizations that I find really interesting to watch is Automatic by Matt Mullenweg, who did WordPress, which is entirely a distributed organization. And people have said all along that he can't scale that culture, this culture of absolute freedom, autonomy, of distributed work. And he's been very intentional in terms of how he structures the company. And so when he does his interviews, he hires people very stringently on their ability to work on their own. So he does an interview over chat on a phone. They're given a really tough project to see if they can even manage that before they get in. And then as well, he's worked really hard to build in a structure for how people report to one another within the distributed work to make this scalable. And so it's really interesting that I think more cultures can be scaled than people realize if you're very intentional about planning it up front and thinking about how to be intentional about it rather than reactive. So once you get to a point that you scale and there's communication errors or people are not voicing their opinions or whatever, it's a lot harder to fix that than up front to have a good plan for how to scale a culture.
Makes sense. So conflict in startup teams is something that seems to occur from time to time, maybe often. How should conflict and that type of problem be managed in a startup team?
So it depends heavily on the type of conflict. When we talk about conflict in small groups, there's different types of things that you can fight about in a group. If you're fighting about the content of your startup, about choices on the product over design questions, those type of conflicts can be really healthy for creativity and innovation. That if you think differently than I do about who our customer base should be, it could actually expand our insight of the product. It can lead us to know more about one another and to be able to readapt or realign our product to better meet the needs that we see differently from our different perspectives and backgrounds. So task conflicts, I think, should be embraced, but you have to manage them with care. Because what we find in our research is that 70% of the time, people take task conflicts personally. And the minute that it becomes personal, of you're disagreeing with my view on the product because you don't like me, or you think that I'm stupid, or you don't respect my background or my position, The minute that it becomes personal, people get emotional. And once emotions get involved, conflicts are not going to be useful for team performance. And so for startups to do well, they really need to learn how to have conflicts in a way that's healthy. And this comes from having a really healthy culture of respect up front, of hiring people that you respect, and making sure that you do things like job crafting every now and then to make sure that you're on the same page about what people are good at and what they enjoy doing, and that you can respect one another. Offsites and team buildings are important too to build trust, so that when you do have these task debates, people trust that, okay, I know that you think I'm awesome. You're disagreeing with me because you just sincerely have a different opinion or a different idea or different information about this question than I do. And then those conflicts are wonderful. And the dark side of conflict then are these personal conflicts, of relationship conflicts that come from personality clashes, from misunderstandings, of issues of respect. Those you want to avoid going there if you can, so by having a healthy culture up front and making sure you hire people that can get along. If you do have a relationship conflict that's tough, and particularly in startups more so than other companies, because startup members are often friends or even family members. There's people with really deep relationships, and so resolving relationship conflicts there are incredibly tricky. Oftentimes, if you talk to executive coaches, the only solution then is once you hit a real deep relationship conflict in a startup is to fire, unfortunately. If you have, for example, a situation where that's not possible, ways I'd say make it work, particularly for, say, like examples where you have married couples running a startup together. I talked to a coach who created a physical space in the office, like literally like a box that was drawn in the corner. And in that box, the husband and wife could go to have their conflict about the startup, and they had to promise one another when they crossed over the line into that box, we are no longer husband and wife, we have no personal relationship, we have no expectations, we have no biases, we have no baggage. We are going to have a discussion just about our startup and the product. And by making that physical space and like making them intentionally like drop all the history, all the tension, all the relational background when they went into that physical space, and giving them a safe place and to have that conversation where they both make this commitment to one another to just focus only on the task, that was a solution that she found worked pretty well in that situation. I thought that was kind of a cool example. There's two more types of conflicts you can have in startups that are also difficult. One is process conflicts, and this is fighting about logistics. It's fighting about equity. It's fighting about leadership. It's fighting about who's going to be externally facing versus internally facing. The logistics of making your startup work. Generally, what's interesting we found is that these type of conflicts are even more negative for performance than relationship conflicts. So these are by far the most negative type of conflict ever shown. There's never been a single study ever to find a positive effect of this type of conflict. So if you're in a startup and you're fighting over these issues, you really need to put a big foot on the brakes and figure out what's going on. And the reason why these process conflicts are so dangerous is often the reason why you're fighting is not what you're fighting about. So if you're fighting about equity, you're not fighting necessarily about money, you're fighting about respect or how valued people feel within the startup. And so if you're trying to divide equity and it's come to loggerheads, there's a bigger underlying issue, which is how we talked about our roles, our broader respect levels, our hierarchy in the startup, because equity is just one outcome of that. If you're fighting about who's going to be externally facing to the VC world, for example, it probably means that you haven't really had a good discussion over roles in the team, over, who prefers and is good at being external versus who prefers and good at operations. And that's the discussion you should be having. But once you're fighting about, I want to be talking to that VC, why can't I do that? You've gotten away from the underlying issue, which is clarifying roles. And so whenever you hit a conflict about something logistical, something silly, something small over how do we run the business, you need to take a step back and ask, well, why does this matter? Why do you care about the equity? Why do you care about that role? Why do you care about making sure that we get our supplies from that vendor? And get to the real issue. And then you can resolve that, which is often going to be a value conflict. It could be a status conflict of people trying to vie for a position in the hierarchy. It could be a relationship conflict of people who just disagree with one another at a personal level, and they vent it in a way that's more easy to vent, which is on logistical issues. And the last type of conflict, which you very rarely see openly done, is status conflict. And status conflicts come back in all the other types of conflicts. That you disagree with somebody on the product because you just want to one-up them in front of the founder. Or that you disagree with somebody about roles on the task because you want to have a more prestigious position than you do. And these conflicts are tough to resolve because you almost never see them explicitly aired. And so as a founder, you really need to be on time to notice these indirect airings of status conflicts and find ways to fix it. either by making clear to everybody what the hierarchy is in the team and having discussions about, if someone is unsatisfied with their role, what you can do to realign that to make them more satisfied. Those are the key issues that come up in terms of conflict in startups. So the main point, I guess, is just to have a good culture to begin with, where you have the task conflicts and not these other ones. Because once these other ones are there, fixing them once they're up is a lot harder than preventing them in the first place. And by preventing them, by having trust, respect, clarity, and structure, etc.
Makes sense. And lots of valuable tips and advice, I think, there for startup people. How can innovation be encouraged and managed in startup teams? This is something obviously we see as something that startups are keen to do, but how can they best do it?
So for me, when I answer this question, it'll be coming from a people psychology question. I mean, there's other ways you can talk about innovation, but for me, it always will come from the lens of psychology. So when you talk about innovation in terms of teams, startup teams in particular, one of the most essential roots for that is having a diverse team to begin with and having those complementary skill sets. Because if everybody thinks exactly alike, you're never going to push each other outside of the box. And in order to have a truly innovative pivot or truly innovative idea for your product, you need to be pushed outside of the box. So by having both diversity within your team, but also in the advisors in your network that you go to. And by choosing mentors, incubators, and VCs that also have complementary skill sets to one another and to your team, so that you're covering your tasks from every angle you can. And that when you're having these discussions about where to go, you're getting every perspective you can from every different possible angle. A. B, in order to have, though, a healthy task conflict, as I mentioned, so you have all these different perspectives that could give a very creative solution, you have to keep it task-oriented and not let it turn into just a fight or a brawl or relationship conflict. So innovation also comes from having a culture of cohesion and psychological safety. And that could come from hiring people in the beginning who share values with you, who share a passion for the product. And because that commonality is so great, it gives people a lot of slack when they disagree about the task because they know we're all doing it because we love this product. That's the reason why we're disagreeing. And then making sure that you invest as you go in having a motivated vision, motivating culture, that you're doing team buildings, that you're building relationships among people. All that really helps teams to be able to be safe enough for people to dare to out the crazy ideas. One of the things they've shown that's interesting too in promoting at least the idea generation side of innovation is when you want to do a brainstorm session in teams, even in teams where you have a pretty high level of psychological safety, people are scared, particularly when the CEO is there, to say the crazy idea. There's a high level of evaluation apprehension. Additionally, while you're sitting in the circle with the five of you and you're waiting your turn to say your idea, you can forget your idea or be influenced by somebody else's idea. And so you sort of lose the value of that diversity that you have there. So one of the really easy hacks to do brainstorming innovation in teams like that is for everybody to go to the computer and do the brainstorm session in an online chat room. Because then you can't see the raised eyebrow of the boss. And there's been a lot of research that's shown that hierarchy doesn't show up virtually. The lower levels of people in the team will speak up much more easily in a chat room than they would face-to-face in a meeting, A. And then B, in an online chat room, everybody can talk at the same time. And you have a log of what's said. So you're not going to have the production blocking of having to wait your turn. So that helps a lot with the innovative process. And so that's more so for coming up with a creative idea. And the other part of innovation then is how do you develop that idea to a meaningful product? And what's relevant in terms of teamwork and startups there is having a really good transactive memory system, we call it in academia, or a shared view of who's who in the team, and we know who to go to for what. But it's really hard to develop an idea if it's not clear who should be taking ownership of what facet of the development. And so by doing things like job crafting, where you have really clear roles and you reflect on what you're doing and everybody knows who's doing what in the team, it's a lot easier than to break up the idea, go work on your bits and pieces of it, and then come back together to make the final product. So having a really clear coordination system in place and also making sure that you have clear leadership matters a lot in that process too, of having somebody that can coordinate the different aspects and the different assignments that people are researching and working on and building where you're developing out this idea to make the final product.
Interesting. So you started to refer, or you did refer to discussions, brainstorms that you would undertake virtually.
Yeah.
How do you view virtual teams overall? Do they face different issues than teams are located together physically?
Yeah, they really do. I usually teach virtual teams as a capstone lecture in a Teams course because I think of any type of team, virtual teams are by far the most difficult to manage. that they have the highest need for coordination, and they also have the highest susceptibility for negative conflicts. That being said, they do offer some advantages. They offer the advantage, for example, of creativity, that it equalizes participation. Everybody in the organization is very empowered to speak up. Also in terms of flexible work conditions that motivate workers and having a culture that people want to work in. Allowing virtual organizations allows people a lot of autonomy to work flexibly, to work remotely, and to have, to build their family life into their job in a way that's meaningful. So that's why you would want to do it. And so organizations like Automatic with Matt Mullenweg do this very well and have really motivated, high-performing organizations because of the flexibility and the benefits this allows. Also, virtual teams allow you to get the best people in the world. You're not limited to the talent pool in your location. Silicon Valley, it's really hard to hire. If you're a virtual organization, you can hire anywhere. A lot of benefits. But then the challenge is then, and why this is really hard to pull off, is when people communicate electronically, there's a lot of room for misattribution and misinterpretation. One of the most politically incorrect but hilarious trainings that I've seen in virtual teams was at a bank in the Netherlands. They were talking about the miscommunications that happen virtually. And they had a sentence that had people read on a piece of paper. My boss slept with that woman. And then they went through the different ways this could be read. My boss slept with that woman. 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 20 totally different stories are going to be told at the coffee machine the next day from a sentence of written text. 20 totally different lines of gossip. As you can imagine, then every time that you send an email virtually or you send a chat or you blog, they don't know your tone of voice. They don't know which words you want to accentuate. They don't know your expression, your emotion when you're saying it. They have to guess. And we know that people are inherently biased and irrational. And whenever people have to guess, we're often not going to be right. And so in virtual teams, you have a whole host of conflicts and miscommunications because if someone says something, you interpret it negatively, you attack them, they see you attacking them, and when you write words in black and white of why did you do that, people react even more heavily because it is literally black and white on the screen. Conflicts escalate really quickly. And it's really hard to resolve them because you're not able to see the other person face to face or see their emotions to help figure out how to fix it. You're kind of screwed. So virtual teams are really, really tough because of these conflicts and these miscommunications. So if you are going to work virtually and try to take advantages of it, what we usually recommend then is the importance of having a face-to-face kickoff and getting together face-to-face at least every 6 months or so for like a good week to make sure that people understand the context of what's being said. If you know someone's personality, if you know how they live their life, if you know what they're passionate about and what they're working on, it's a whole lot easier to make an informed guess when you're having to interpret a line of text than if you don't know anything about the person. And so investing in that helps a lot. I know that Automatic, for example, from Matt Mullenweg, he flies everybody together every 6 months for a week, and they do crazy team trainings together. They drive Ferraris together. They have weeks in Barcelona. There was a house in New Orleans. It rotated from team to team. And I think that's one of the reasons why he has a really successful distributed organization is because he really builds in the importance of face-to-face interaction on a regular basis. And the rest of the time, fine. You can be behind your computer wherever you want, whenever you want. But every so often you do have a chance to rebuild those connections face-to-face and those emotional bonds that allows you to get work done.
Okay, thank you. And I have one final question for you, Lindy, which is really just a summary question to ask you what you think the most important advice is that you can give technology entrepreneurs about how to maximize the effectiveness of their teams. What's the most important thing for them to remember?
Be intentional about how you manage your people.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Lindy. I really appreciate you talking to me and creating this video for people at Waterloo. The content, I think, is extremely rich. You've provided a lot of great practical advice that technology entrepreneurs would do well to listen to. So thank you very much for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me here. It was fun to have a conversation.
Yes, I thought so too.